All right, this is the last home stretch. We just got to close out our previous work, and all four groups did a great job. I want to introduce Christopher Parkinson. He's from Clemson University. He's a professor there, and he's with the Herpetology Society. It's Herbicide Society. He gets rid of the weeds. Anyway, uh, I think Tracy's going to help out with this. Okay, good. All right, so I'll turn it over to you guys.
All right, thank you very much. So I think the goal of this scenario that was written about a lizard via a mammologist really was just to get people to think about different aspects of that. And so you have four different groups. One of them was the overachiever group who liked to write a lot, it looks like. So what I thought we could do, if it's okay with my is have each group give a little bit of the main key points that they came up with, what their IACUCs would ask. Does that sound appropriate? All right, so how about the overachiever group? We'll start there first.
And if we did our job well enough, the rest of you can just sit down. You won't have anything to add, right? So we'll see. The first thing we started out is our moderator attempted to get us to pay attention to the task. We said, no, first we have to decide, do we even need a protocol at all? Because is this management going on? It's being funded by the DNR. Okay. We went through a lot of different ideas, most of which are up here. Who's doing it? Who's funding it? What is it affecting? Is it materially affecting the animal? We eventually came to the conclusion, yes, it needs a protocol for no other reason that at least you want to protect that graduate student. If they want to publish this, they're probably going to have to cite an IACUC protocol, so might as well give them a protocol. But there's still debate on that. We looked at occupational hazards, and as you can see, we attempted to do this by color, but we ran out of colors before we ran out of topics. But a lot of different occupational hazards. Remember all of these because they will apply once we get to the other two species that we addressed. But zoonoses, being actually attacked by the animal that you're capturing. Are there other animals in the vicinity which are venomous? It's a rocky outcrop. It's a remote location. You probably have to worry about people being trained to deal with themselves out in the wilderness and how they get located, what happens if they break a leg, general first aid, that type of thing. You have sharps, poisonous plants, weather, all those things that go with dealing outside. Animal acquisition, fair amount of stuff here. Are people trained to do this capture method using the noose so that you minimize the potential danger to the animals? How many are you capturing? What happens when you capture? What is the restraint method? There's nothing that in the scenario that described this, we would expect the IACUC to understand what is exactly happening to that animal from the time that you go to noose it until you actually release it back on its own. What happens if you have morbidity or mortality out there? Again, time of holding, that relates to how long they're going to that. This is a species of special concern in the state, as was stated in the scenario. So we assume the permit takes that into account, okay? But the IACUC probably want to ascertain that, in fact, a number of things that go on here, and you'll notice we mentioned when we came across the others too. Is it the right time of year to be doing it? What time of year are they doing it? Wasn't stated in the scenario. You need to know that. It could relate to the breeding pattern of those animals. It could relate to hibernation status, anything else. You want to be sure you're doing it at the right time. Also, you have to worry about if you're capturing multiple animals, depending upon how you're doing the restraint. If the animals, they're of concern, they're declining, maybe there's some biotic situation that's causing them to decline, a disease or something, you don't want to give another animal what that first animal had. So there's a consideration. Do you have to change gloves, change your restraint method, whatever it is between animals? Something to be considered that the PI is probably going to know about, but the IACUC should ask, okay? Also, we're assuming that the release was at the point of capture, that in fact, although it wasn't stated in the scenario, that you're noosing them, doing your measurements, taking your tissue samples, blood samples, and then releasing them right there, but it wasn't clear. Or are you taking them back to a field location someplace? Okay, tissues, there was almost nothing said about what was being captured here, what tissue. It said take a blood sample, but not from where, how much blood, and the rest. All of that should be something the IACUC needs to know. Are there going to be any anesthetics or analgesics used for this? Or is, in this species, is it be considered just no more than momentary distress? Okay, we need to know where, how much the tissue. Um, and again, if the animal was hurt during the tissue taking, what do you do for euthanasia? Also, you want to be sure that you didn't waste this research and make sure that your tissues were properly protected and your blood samples until they got back to the lab. Okay? And someone asked the question, okay, is that really the IACUC's purview? Our answer as a group was that it is of the IACUC's purview because if you ended up wasting all of that, you've essentially captured all these animals for no good, or for no good reason. Identification, we spent some time on this trying to understand exactly what the elastomeric tags were, and we got pictures of those and passed them around. The big question that came up, if you're trying to recapture, are you trying to target those animals that you have already captured? And in which case is a fairly cryptic elastomeric tag enough for you to know, oh, I got that one last time, let me get him again. But it wasn't clear whether the intent of the study was to try and do a classic recapture method where you don't want to know which animal you captured for, and statistically then you use how many you do recapture to estimate the population, or whether you were really targeting those that you had before. And should you use a very visible form of identification if that's your intent to get the ones that you had before? So obviously the IACUC would need to know much more about the actual scientific aim and the research design in order to ask the graduate question whether this is the appropriate way to identify them. Okay, we wonder if there's any data on whether the elastomeric tags had any effect on the animals. Whether, let's see, again, not knowing, are we targeting particular genders, age, does it make a difference at time of year? Are you trying to get juveniles, adults, et cetera? And then the impact on the animal once it goes out there, if the tag is cryptic to you, but it might not be to the predators, we don't know. So we'd ask for data on that if it's available. Going from there to mice, we identified one. Again, this is a species of concern, so it needs special permits probably. It is covered under the Animal Welfare Act. It may be a mouse, but it's not a mouse of the genus Moose, bred for research purposes. Okay, again, most of the things that apply over here apply here. You have zoonoses. In this case, you're using a trap, so you're going to get bycatch, which you wouldn't in the new thing. Okay, so you have to consider what happens to that animal in the trap because they're being housed in that trap. They need food, they need water, they need temperature regulation, they need protection from predators, depending on how long they're in the trap. Nothing said how long they'd be out there, how long you are visiting. Frequency between visits to the trap, we want to be sure about that. We question the use of ear tags. Does that make a difference to the animal once it's out in the wild? Whether coyotes can zero in on ear tags or not, we don't know, but it'd be something to ask. Also, are you doing it at the time of year where you may not, if it's a species that's declining, you probably don't want to be doing it in the middle of breeding season. So again, information the IACUC would need to know. Fish, again, you've got bycatch using a SEN. This is, in fact, an endangered species. We checked this up if we can believe the internet anyway. Okay, so you want to minimize the amount of bycatch, but you want to maximize the number of animals that you get. So mesh side is very important for your SEN, also how the SEN is used. Okay. Environmental health issues are probably very different in terms of the zoonoses you look for, okay, and other things you can get, not just zoonoses, from dealing with aquatic animals. Okay, euthanasia methods is always very different for fish than for animals. We questioned freeze branding. Someone actually went on the internet and looked up and said that freeze branding is very common, okay, in fish, but on catfish it may not last more than a year. And they're talking about a 2-year study and looking at recapture. You may not know that you captured it before if the freeze branding has disappeared. So that would be a question that would need to be answered. Aquamation, same thing. Holding time of the fish. Again, what is happening to that fish from the time you catch it to when you let it go? Are you putting it in a tank? Especially if you're using a seine, you have to get out the bycatch and catch your animal. Is it going into a bucket for a while? You know, we don't know. Those details need to be fleshed out. Other drugs, well, the issue of anesthesia, if you are using some types of sedation on the animal before you do the freeze branding, what is the effect on that animal? If the animal is then let back into the environment, there are probably things you can't use for sedation. Okay, again, the frequency of capture, if it's a sensitive species, how often do you expect it to be caught in the SEN again? We don't know how many times they were seining the same stream. Okay, tissue collection, same questions as before. And obviously, a lot came down to what is the existing permit allow you to do.
Excellent. Questions for this group?
All right, let's go to the opposite group, our underachievers who didn't write anything down. That's Bob's group. So who was the
Who's
who was
reporting?
the
We did write stuff down. Yeah. we we had paper, but I wrote it down on my laptop. Documentation occurred. Let's see. I guess let me go through just the items that differ from what they.
That'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Um, Definitely taking into consideration the remoteness of the study site. If the PI could provide more information on whether it's a day trip and they go back home at the end of the day, or are they going to be backpacking and digging pits to stay out there for a month or something, and that will then relate to the OC health issues as well. Then also we had a side discussion about OC health process. Is it parallel or absorbed into the ICOOC protocol review process? We also talked about how safe is are all of the activities, and would having a video or photograph appendix to the protocol helpful? Is it group capture or is it one by one for all of these species? And then is there temporary housing? And then we're going into what is the purpose of the collection, and then would blood collection suffice, or would you need more tissue? The other thing we talked about, the what if this was an international collaboration? What are the international ethical reviews in terms of publication and stuff like that? Was a side discussion that we had. Hold on. Okay, so then for the mice discussion, we talked about the pain and distress of handling compared to the procedures that the animal would go under. What is the animal's distress really about? And then for the non-target species, for the OC health, to make sure that the OC health issues also address exposure to non-target species, such as hantavirus for Paramiscus genus, but also then someone mentioned raccoons, and that made me think of rabies. And then for the, let's see, the fish we wrote down, there was one thing here that we had written down I didn't see mentioned. It was about the seining procedure, about the appropriateness of it and net abrasion from seining, and how would it affect the fish health afterwards, and would electrofishing be an alternative procedure, and something to consider and discuss with the PI, I believe. Anything else? That's it.
All right, fantastic. All right,
Group number 3.
Michael, you want to go?
We kind of jumped right in and started by looking at the data, the type of data that they were collecting, and quickly looked and saw that, well, the recapture data doesn't really match what they're taking initially. And then we also had a couple of recommendations for additional data that they could take that could help out the ICUC with a few of the questions that we did have, such as, do the elastomer tagging, does that method cause any adverse effects, maybe sublethal effects? So we said, well, maybe they could take mass as well and track the mass of the animals as well when they're capturing them, and probably stage as well. Another thing, like, does the recapture methods, affect reproduction? Let's see. We also said, okay, the capture methods, probably some citation would be in order, given that most IACUCs are not going to be very familiar with noosing, and that's going to sound terrible. You're putting a noose around the animal, why are you hanging it? But you know, they're all alternatives, and we'd recommend to the writers of this protocol to also list those alternatives. We kind of went over one of them, or a couple of them, which is a slingshot, usually peas, or a blowgun in peas, and that can actually cause mortality, direct mortality in the animal, whereas the noosing method doesn't. Then we kind of went into a little bit about personal safety, working in the rocky terrain in a desert situation, or in glades in Missouri, maybe where this might be, you know, getting along, you know, what some of the other groups have discussed as well. What kind of personal protective equipment are you providing your people? You don't want someone to fall off a rock ledge and tumble down. We then kind of got into discussions of scientific merit. Who decides this? You know, and it was a pretty good discussion. But generally, the people at the larger universities have said, well, that's already taken care of because they've gotten grant funding. That had to go through a review panel. They had to get their permits. That had to go through a review panel. But we had some people from a smaller university that has internal funding. So the ICA kind of has to step in a little bit there and review the scientific method because those mechanisms really weren't there or available to them. So yeah, usually the funding entity is going to judge the merit of the project by, well, giving it funding. Let's see. We did get into the tissue and blood sample details, just like everybody else. It was extremely sparse. Storage of the tissues. What happens to them when the researchers get back? Are they going to be deposited in a tissue bank, in a major museum, in a freezer in the lab? You know, how are they going to be transferred? How are they going to be stored in the field so that they don't deteriorate? Some more of the technical procedures described. You know, it just says we're going to take blood and/or tissue sample. Well, are you going to take a leg of the lizard? Or are you going to take, you know, are you going to take muscle tissue? Or are you going to take a toe? You know, we discussed that sort of thing. And, you know, those of us that had some reptile experience said, now you're going to take a tail clip because they have caudal autonomy. They'll drop their tail anyway, and just putting pressure on it, you know, that'll be easiest. Or if you're going to bleed them, you're going to bleed them from the tail as well. What else? We talked a little bit more about tissues too. That was, oh, what's the end goal for the tissues? You know, we heard a few people talk about that too. Is this for an upcoming project, you know, or a project that's not planned yet, but while we're out there, you know, capturing the animals, we want to make the most of the animals that we capture. Even though we don't have the funding for genetic studies, you know, we would recommend then to the researcher that they just put in a brief, you know, statement of what the tissues might be used for in the future, just to kind of justify it for themselves. We talked about seasonality. When would you do the captures and everything? I heard someone say, well, we wouldn't do it during the reproductive season. That's the best time to catch these lizards, is the reproductive season. So, you know, you got a little bit of an issue there. Let's see, we talked about what was covered. You know, we kind of switched over to the mice, and you know, the mice are covered. Let's see. We talked about, you know, what you potentially could get from doing this field work, and you know, the mice, because we're not so concerned that the lizards were going to give us anything, you know. But when you get to the mice, you could think of all kinds of things: rabies, you know, start working with mammals, hantavirus. There was a time that our, you know, I'll give a little spiel here, that our OSP people, we wanted to do mouse trapping with our rattlesnake studies because we wanted to track the predator and the prey. And that went to our OSP people, and occupational health and safety people, and I just tanked it because they wanted us in respirators, in full suits and everything because of hantavirus, and I'm like, no, we're just not going to do this project. You know, how about that? So there's a little bit of education to do, you know, even with those groups of people, you know, for wildlife studies. Let's see. We talked a little bit about the electrofishing and the seining and bycatch, and had a fellow said you can get how many lots? Thousands sometimes, you know, when you're electrofishing and stuff that are bycatch. Yeah. Yep. It can be difficult, and you can lose a lot of fish. What do? And that's where we got to talking about MS-222, and what was the other one? I didn't. Acquiesce. That's working its way through the system. We talked a lot about PPE and decon because that's also not brought up in there. Just think of all the wildlife diseases that are out there now, with white nose decimating bats. What sort of decon are people doing when they're going into the caves and out of the caves? And how often are you sampling? Are you stressing the stressed bat populations more? If you're going from wetland to wetland, especially if you're going to areas that are fairly remote that the general public doesn't go to, you don't want to bring rhinovirus into that new wetland and decimate a population or a community of organisms. We talked about so that was site to site we talked about, but you also got to worry about individual to individual. So I work with rattlesnakes that have SFD. And we're very concerned. We don't want to transfer that from individual to individual. So you've got another layer that you have to worry about.
Snake fungal disease.
Yes, snake fungal disease. Yep, sorry. So what type of protective equipment are you going to use and ensure that? Let's see. We did talk about the length of the markers and their duration, and if the marking methods were appropriate. Could they use a different one or a backup? We just said that the elastomers or the freeze branding only lasted, what, a year? Elastomers may last only a couple years. What other options do you have, to permanently mark these animals? And also, going back with the citation, most ICUCs aren't going to know. How are you going to mark a lizard, present them with the options and say, well, we could toe clip them. We don't want to do that because that's pretty destructive. We're going to start cutting off toes. We could use pit tags, in adults, the passive integrated transponders that the microchips put into our pets. But we can't do that with the little guys. We could try photographs and see, but realize with the photographs, there's going to be increased handling time because you got to identify that individual. So you're holding on to that individual longer, you're stressing it. You could try you could try the computer programs, but they're not really there yet. But that means you got to carry the computer to the field site, or you got to carry the animal, back to some other location. And with this species, let's say the collared lizard, being territorial, defending a territory, and it's during mating season, what happens when we remove him for 2 days to do our work and then come back? Oh, someone else took over the territory and has mated with the female. What have we done to our study now and to the natural population? So thinking about things like that. We talked about proficiency and training because a lot of that was not covered in that protocol. For any of the species, let's say, who's doing the training? What kind of training? Are there alternative people for the training? How is it being documented? And we discussed a little bit about how the different ICUCs that are represented here take care of that. Let's see, we talked a little bit about habitat disturbances, the non-target species and bycatch. Talked a lot about that in the fish and kind of expected mortalities. But as they brought up too, that can happen with the mammals because the mammals are going to be in a trap. So you're going to have to know how often are you checking the trap, or you have food in the trap. Do you have all sorts of things? Whereas with the lizard, we don't have to worry about bycatch at all because you're going to zone right in on a collared lizard, not going to catch another type of lizard.
Now, he's a herpetologist, so I've got to give him props now. And the third and final, or the fourth and final, right here.
Okay, so with the first, with the lizard, the noosing capture methods, we wanted to see a photo or a description of what that apparatus looks like. And we want to actually see the permit because they're going to capture and they're going to take tissues and release them. So we want to make sure that all of those are covered on the permit. Tissue and or blood, how will they decide and when? Are they going to decide when they're on site, or are they going to roll it around before they go out there? How much volume of blood, and also the methods, how they're going to remove tissues and blood. Also the procedure description, details from past research. So if this is a renewal protocol and they've been doing this in the past, we want to know what their everything from the non-target species to failure successes and you know, things that didn't quite work. Also to bring in an expert on the taxa when to do with any of these, because we had Wikipedia lit up there because OH&S, Field Safety Plan. These little guys have a strong jaw, and they could also have salmonella, so we wanted to make sure that was included, and also the weather. You know, the terrain, the weather, day, night. And yeah, the permits are a good source of information because they will list on there. The training background of the PI and students. Non-target species are there mimics? Is the target or the non-target venomous? And a genetic analysis. Would you have to do that to discern whether it is a target or the non-target species? Can you sex them by visual, or do you have to perform a surgery to know the sex? And also to understanding the animal's ecology and physiology. If you had an example, if the lizard urinates, that could be emptying their canteen. We know this water that they've accumulated, so you have to be thinking about that. Golden mice, first off, they're really cute. The traps, how, where, the style of them, the checking frequency for the trap target and non-target species. Provisions for animals is extremely important. Shelter, food, water must be incorporated. The target number, the estimation or the minimum number that you expect to trap. Would the ear tags hamper survival? Would the females think they're better looking or not as good looking? On the OH&S, the diseases, the bites. And tissue and or blood also, how and how much. And maximum holding times. Mice, like the shrews, we discussed shrews and mice. They're like, you know, they're very fast at metabolizing their food. So a shrew can die within hours of not eating. The fish, it's an endangered species and their spines have venom. Non-target, how would you handle them? How would you release them? The marking method, liquid nitrogen, no. Anesthesia required, what's the method and what are the disposals? So we're talking about MS-222 and other. We use clove oil still in Canada because there's still a debate about the MS-222 and the clove oil. So it really depends where they're going. If they're going to a very remote spot, we allow them to take the clove oil. It took me about 6 months to get all the information from our agencies that deal with aquatic species. And the decision was that MS-222 could be diluted in a large body of water, like a lake or an ocean. It can be denatured by leaving it in sunlight. So there's, you know, but clove oil is much better. Okay. And something that we started at our institution in Canada, because we had some field researchers were actually in public places, public parks. There was trails that the public would be going on. We got a big complaint from the public about a Cooper hawk study. So now when they go out in the field, if they're going to be anywhere near the public, we ask them if there's any chance that research may be viewed by Joe Public. We ask the PIA to produce an information pamphlet which lists the institution, who they are funded by, the nature of the research and procedures, and what benefits will be achieved. So it's a nice little thing for the grad students to do a nice colorful pamphlet to hand out to the public.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I guess you heard a lot of similar types of concerns across the board. So I think this team together has learned to ask certain types of questions, but you also heard differences among all four panels. And so what the real goal here is to take some of that back, like the educational pamphlet. So we've actually had to do that on our team as well, working down in the Keys and using cover boards and things. And they wanted to know, or our sea turtle group, they wanted to know when I was at the University of Central Florida. And it works. It's amazing how well it works because you move them from being John Q. Public to educated John Q. Public, and they're being positive about that. And so that's a great aspect that you can potentially take back. A lot of focus on the training. I think that's one thing that we're starting to hear a lot about as well, is the training.
I have a question about the storage concerns of the specimens and including it in the protocol. And I just wanted to tally. How common is that to include in an IACUC protocol versus a PI asking the IACUC subject matter expert, so on and so forth, for advice on that?
Okay, so I think what you're asking is when wildlife PIs are taking tissue samples and things like that, how often do we include something in our protocol that explains what we're doing with those tissue samples and things like that? So I can tell you from my perspective what we've done in the past, and it is tissues end up staying and going with the specimen. So if we take a voucher specimen and that's getting deposited into Museum X, we will put tissues of that with that museum as well, and copies of our permits and things like that. Other institutions and other researchers that I've talked to and deal with, voucher specimens go to the museum and the tissue samples stay with the PI. Okay, what are other aspects out there? What do other? Oh, and wanting to see that in the protocol.
Yeah, the appropriateness of the storage of the specimens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. I didn't understand. That's a great question. I can give you my personal opinion.
It would be an FYI back to the PI. You know, I'm very insistent that the protocol is for live animals, and at euthanasia is when information stops. For an IACUC protocol, the permits and things like that would obviously be very
And-
different.
See, I would argue with that because we would want to make sure that those specimens were able to be used for what they intended to use them for, and that they would supply the information, because we are deciding that that live animal, that we can go and basically change that live animal's entire life, whether it's been euthanized or whether it's been caught, tail clipped, and released. We have to be able to confidently say that the tissue that's been collected is going to has the potential to supply the information it was collected for.
I collect a lot of tissues non-invasively from animals that are then released for DNA analysis, and I always say how I'm going to take the tissue and what I'm going to use it for, but I've never been asked to explain how I plan to store it or transport it, or how I'm going to extract and analyze the DNA for that matter.
And our group was the one that asked that question, and I think I was the one that asked back, why would you need to know that information? Why would the IACUC need to know that information? And the answer I got was, what Larry said, was essentially that we want to make sure that that animal's life was not wasted.
So I can tell you what I do personally, in my opinion, is every tissue sample we take is given a voucher number, so a CLPT number, and it is deposited in the Christopher L. Parkinson tissue collection, which will eventually be deposited into a natural history museum, and it is available for other researchers to ask. And that's actually in my protocol, just as an FYI. Tissues are cataloged and no, I don't. Yeah, I don't go into that at all. Yeah, no. And so
right? We're talking about a conversation with the PI about what it is they know about this species and the work they're trying to do. I was just trying to suss out how many protocols actually include this and why, where the justification lied, and then also how it could also happen outside of protocol review.
yeah, no, I've never been asked in any of my protocols about how I transport those once I've taken them or anything. I will put in there that the tissues are taken and stored in either ethanol or RNA, yeah, it's RNA buffer. I can't remember the actual trade name of it. RNA later. Thank you.
At our institution, we only ask for how they're being stored, prepared, transported. If it is a necessary to repeat because they lost samples in a prior protocol. So if their freezer broke or if their samples were no good, we ask for justification for repeating on how they're going to prevent that in the future.
So I actually have a question for the group. Is anybody here on like a human IRB? Because that would be a good question, because I know I used to be on studies back when I worked on human stuff about storage, and I don't know if that's something that they require, because it seems like I understand the justification for it, but using those animals, but but at some point we can't keep reaching that far into their science.
I was going to say, I think a lot of this arose from the fact that this was being done in the lizard study anyway, in remote areas. We had no idea whether they're going to be out there for 2 weeks or whether they're doing it on a day trip. If it was a day trip, it might be a moot question. If they're going to be out there for 2 weeks, I would think it's up to the IACUC to make sure that they have thought through, how do I keep those specimens? One of the other things that factored into that, this was a grad student's protocol. We had some discussion about how the grad student was probably writing it. And there are some things grad students may not completely think through. We want to be sure the IACUC helps them do that.
Yeah, a graduate student mammologist wrote that protocol. We won't go down that road. I can't remember where he was educated. But to that effect, okay, so I had a team spend 57 days in Mexico this summer. Okay, so anywhere between 4 and 8 individuals on the team traveling around. I think they hit 15 or 18 states in Mexico collecting reptile samples. And, it's a great question, but let me tell you what, if we're going to spend the money that we're doing on that trip, and an IACUC looked at me and asked me that question, it almost goes against my personal little thing. However, I would answer it, because we've spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort, and also animal welfare, because we don't want those animal tissues or animals to go to waste. I mean, this is the first time in 22 years we've been able to get all the proper permits to do the work. So it's a big deal, and so you're investing a lot of time and effort. So I think it's very informational. My personal opinion is I don't know if it needs to be in there, other than here's how we're taking the tissues, and we will store them in appropriate buffers. But that's my opinion.
There's definitely a balance, and our IACUC tries to find that balance between insulting the PI for something that is routine science, that every competent PI should be able to take the tissues and get them into the lab in a timely manner for whatever needs that type of tissue and analysis has. Where we would get into it a little more in depth as if it was endangered, and so you have a one-time shot at it to make sure that they have everything they need, in part so that we can help them if they don't have what they need, and make sure that communication is that's documented, that the university is doing the right thing by these critical samples. And the other thing would be something such as way out in the field, on top of a mountain that's in the middle of nowhere, or they're traveling for extended periods of time, and that there's going to be difficulties. And again, working with remote species that are rare, if not actually on a list of some kind. So we try to balance that respectfully.
I was just going to respond to the comment that was made that it's probing too much into the science of the researcher, but isn't that our job to do, to justify the scientific question? So if your endpoint, for a lot of my studies, my endpoint is the tissue sample. And so it's, I'd have to justify how I'm collecting the sample from the animal, but if I don't say that I can securely get that, a glucose level or an enzyme from that tissue, then that animal's life then was that, so that I think as researchers sort of on both sides of the coin, I think we have to be careful not to be offended by these questions, and realizing that it is the animal's welfare that sometimes is being considered by asking these questions.
And I think the key point that you made very beautifully is it's a balance. And so, I said I would almost be offended, but I would give them the answer. But sometimes I can tell you I don't think about things because I do it every day. And having to justify that to somebody, it does that. And I do it with my labs. I mean, all my grad students, you know, in my lab, because you have to get them thinking about things a lot and to move things forward. We're actually over time. So
I think it's important to try to design your forms to lead the researchers into those kinds of questions so that they're part of the initial protocol. I think where you end up losing the confidence of the PI is when you keep going back with questions for further clarification, and there's a delay. There's at least a couple of weeks most of the time, often longer, and that's where the frustration begins to build. If they know the questions at the outset and they answer everything, then I think it goes a lot smoother.
And I was going to say much the same thing. You know, we don't ask for these things on our protocol form per se, but we have a habit of inviting the researcher themselves to come and help educate us so that we can ask questions of them directly and count on their expertise to help fill us in and help us understand.
And I think that's a fantastic point, because I was at an institution that tended not to invite the PIs in, and it's different at my new institution, it seems like. And I think that's a fantastic piece to invite them in, have them sit there, go through the protocol to the point, and then, you know, ask them to go out. That's a great point. And I really think it's being able to discuss that open communication. I agree with your point, Tim, of having to go back and go back and go back and go back, because they're just going to go down. And one of the points that I don't see used a lot is bringing in consultants. So academics, especially when it comes to animal care protocols and things like that, there's enough people out there in the community that are willing to help. With today's world of Skype and all the electronic means, it's not a cost. And most of the time, I know I've done it for several universities where I've consulted on snake projects via a Skype interview to talk to the ICUC for 10 minutes. And because I'm, quote, the expert, unquote. And that's a helpful thing to them.
I've been sitting here for the last 15 minutes wanting to respond to the graduate student mammalogist who wrote this, but more specifically to emphasize exactly that point. If you look at the list and if you listen to what was said, consult a subject matter expert. We needed additional information on this. We did additional information on this. A lot of times the subject matter expert is your PI. Bring them in, have a conversation, even if it's by telephone. It solves so many of these problems. Then you're not insulting the PI by going back and forth for 3 weeks. Thank y'all.
All right, let's give a hand to the moderators and your facilitators.
Easy job.
I want to thank everyone. This has been an excellent day. You've been a really good group. Really happy. I'm looking forward to the next 2 days. We have lots of information and fun and knowledge. We start tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. See you bright and early.